Hello everybody and welcome to True North Audio. Kiko here to walk you through our latest contact instruments, Cozy and Concrete. As of the making of this video, Cozy and Concrete are available in their full version for Contact, as well as a set of TCIs for Slate Trigger. There's a free version as well you can download off of our site right now of both Cozy and Concrete for Decent Sampler and Contact. The free and paid version do both require that you own a fully licensed copy of Contact, either 6 or higher. Unfortunately, we just can't afford to actually license it officially at the moment and make it available for Contact Player. Cozy Concrete were recorded with our friends Vasily and Clara of Peak Divide. Clara recorded the drums, Vasily helped to engineer. Both of them did a lot of work on the UI and the visual language and much of the artwork itself. A special thank you to Clara for helping with the color selection, as I cannot see colors, and she absolutely has a better eye for them than I do. Clara is the drummer for bands such as Peak Divide, as well as a great solo artist who you can check out. She and Vasily also work together on the game Unbeatable with D-Cell Games.
You treat me like a criminal, so why shouldn't I treat you like you're a cop?
Links to everything they do are going to be in the description below. You can support them directly and know that there is an even revenue split, so supporting them directly does include purchasing these drums. So Cozy and Concrete are one kit. It is recorded with the same tuning, same pieces, same mics in 2 different spaces. The close mics are unchanged. The rooms are changed for the sake of the room. The 2 rooms it's recorded in are Clara's small bedroom studio and the garage that we also recorded the keg in, and that Peak Divide have recorded drum parts in the past. It's got a really, really big open sound. So we did change the placement of the room mics to capture the sound of the room a little bit better. In Concrete, we also added 1 stereo pair of mics to the room mics in addition to the ones that were included already. Cozy Concrete has 4 toms, 2 rack, 2 floor. There's a kick, there's a snare, there's a 16 and 18-inch crash, there's a hi-hat, a splash, and a ride. The vibe we were going for was very punk rock, very DIY. We wanted something that was kind of sketchy, kind of rough, kind of really raw, really open. And we went for the same thing in the design of the user interface as well. Originally, we were kind of thinking of doing like a skeuomorphic thing, maybe getting like a sort of cheap-looking kind of garage band mixer with little stickers all over it. But we ended up actually deciding that it would be a lot of fun to really lean into that DIY punk rock kind of aesthetic. So we went for a sort of mix of like school notebook and sort of like indie punk zine kind of design for this. And so we all got together and created a lot of art assets and spent some time at the library just making patterns and even designs for different kind of images to represent the different parts of the user interface, and hand animating some of the user controls like the knobs and the buttons. And I'm very glad we did it. It took a long time and was a lot of work, but it was really, really cool, and the results speak for themselves as far as I'm concerned. There are between 14 and 15 mics, depending on which kit you actually have open. There are 3 mics on the kick. One of them is a sub mic. The other 2 are just dynamic mics, which each have a kind of different character and bring out a little bit of something different in the kit. The D6 is a little bit more round. The Beta 91A that we used is a little bit more clicky. There's a snare top, there's a snare bottom, there's a top mic for each of the toms, there's a pair of stereo overheads from Clara's kit, as well as a shotgun, which we have pretty high up over the snare drum as the center overhead, so it picks up a lot of the kit, but it's kind of focused a little bit more on that kick and snare to kind of keep those up the center. The room mics are pretty straightforward. We have a mid-side pair, so there is a condenser playing the role of the mid and a ribbon playing the role of the sides. You can bring those up to taste to get the amount of width you would like and not lose them to your mono compatibility, which can be an issue when you're working with sides. The sides are already processed, so it's just one essentially stereo channel that you can bring up and down as needed. In addition, we also have a binaural headset. In Cozy, it's basically just right in the middle of the room, right in front of the kit. In Concrete, we actually put it in a room at the other side of the garage, kind of tucked away. And on concrete, we also have a pair of slate mics and a stereo pair. They're facing from the front of the kit across the garage to the far wall so that we can get a really long kind of reflection back on them. And they sound really, really huge. And that's the big difference ultimately, is that concrete sounds massive and Cozy is extremely sort of personal and in the space with you. Another thing we went for was to think about accessibility a little bit. The first thing we did is that because we used the hand-drawn, hand-animated style, we knew that handwriting might be a little annoying or difficult for some people to parse, especially with dyslexia. So we found an open-source dyslexic-friendly font, and we created a bunch of these sort of labels for the user interface that we stuck all over it with the information that you need on what is hopefully an easier-to-read label. And there's a button at the top of the interface on all the pages for font that you can just press, and it'll switch out the handwritten font for these sort of labeled type font. The other thing was that while I was making this, I learned how to make the controls visible as macros for screen readers. So I went through and I painstakingly made every control that might be useful or usable that could be assigned as a macro into a macro in the user interface so that this is fully accessible to a screen reader. 2 of the 3 people who work on this were blind. So that is something that we were very aware of. Neither of us were blind enough to need a screen reader, but both of us are blind enough to have worked with and been in community with other musicians who do on a regular. So this is something we were very, very happy to have figured out. I have a video on the channel about how to do that in your contact library. I highly, highly, highly recommend you do, especially if you're a developer. And I have also gone back retroactively and added this feature into all the other contact instruments that we have available in the past as well. And we will be doing this for all the ones in the future too. So without further ado, let's dig into this kit. Starting off with Cozy, we'll walk through the user interface here. The main page is the place that you start whenever you load up Cozy or Concrete. I have the 2 of them currently loaded into one contact instance, and I'll just be switching between the 2 of them back and forth. You'll see for the most part, the user interface is pretty much laid out the same. Again, the only real difference is in the mixer for the extra mic on Concrete. The design of each is kind of built around a different sort of idea. Cozy is a little bit simpler, it's more sketchy, it's a little bit more, again, the like school notebook. Concrete's more of the like poster, the band poster, the indie punk zine kind of vibe. But both of them use more or less the same kind of design language. Starting here at the top, we have the different tabs. These will take you to the different parts of the kit. The mixer for the mixer, bleed for our bleed matrix. The assignments here, keys is the assignments for the different kit pieces. There's 2 pages of that. We'll get into that and why some of that is crossed out later. And then the credits. In addition, as before mentioned, we have this font, and that will change out the written parts for a sort of label, like a typeface label, which should hopefully be a lot easier to read if you have a difficult time reading the handwritten stuff. We have a left-right swap, which swaps between the audience and drummer perspective, or from a left-handed drummer to a right-handed drummer. It switches the left and right side. And then finally, we have the estrogen switch, just a little bleed. If you're wanting to make this sound a little bit more natural, you can turn this on. So without the bleed, put a little bit of estrogen in there, it starts bleeding all over the mics. It's not very sanitary, but it is pretty punk rock. And you'll notice with the bleed on, the kit just sounds a little bit more full, and that's because it's adding and introducing each of the different kit pieces into the other mics, how they sound naturally, and how you would expect to hear them if this was a live tracked kit. And that was a big part of what we wanted to capture with this, was a live sounding kit, something that was very natural, very dynamic, very raw. In addition to that, we have this little notebook down here. These are our master bus effects. We have a compressor, The compressor is based on a standard like G comp, like an SSL, that has your threshold, your ratio, your mix, your attack, your release, and your makeup. And again, being based on the sort of SSL G comp, these are going to work more or less the same way that it works on a G comp. Up here, we have this little X button that indicates that the compressor is currently turned off. You can turn it on by just pressing the button. It'll be on when it's sort of circular. So you can bring in and out which effects you want. The equalizer is very simple. It's just a 3-band. It's a high pass filter, a low pass filter, and then a single frequency bell, which has the frequency, the Q, the narrowness and wideness of the bell, and then the volume, so how much you're bringing it up or down. Once again, you can turn it on and off. And then on the limiter, again, on, off, you have an input, you have a release, and you have a gain. So the input allows you to basically push the sound into the threshold rather than bringing the threshold down. The release is how quickly that limiter is working and releasing what has been pushed into it, so you can make it really tight or just a little bit more kind of open. And then finally you have the gain, so if the limiter is either making it too loud or too quiet, you can bring it up or down as needed. And this also, being at the end of the chain, can serve as a sort of master volume level if you have the limiter engaged. I have all of these set to be very extreme. The limits of all of the controls are basically maxed out on both ends, top and bottom. Usually you would not do that in a library like this, but I wanted to do that because I wanted to do something that was going to be easy to break, something you could really, really, really mess with, and you'll hear that in a couple of the presets where we really did mess with it and break it. But I can also get a little bit more of a kind of even-handed kind of approach to this stuff as well, so you can bring the high pass filter up until it gets rid of the drums completely. Same with the low pass. You can make it really, really narrow and obnoxious. Really wide. You can bring it up basically to the point where the frequency that's being boosted is kind of obnoxious, and even up to the 20K where it's basically out of the range of a lot of people's hearing. Also, you'll notice when I'm handling these, there's these little kind of displays that'll pop up above them. They're all set to kind of pop up in the same place, more or less, just above the control. You'll see on the mixer it's a very similar sort of situation, and that will just give you an indication of the actual value of the control. On top of that, as is usual with one of these kits, when you click on any of these kit pieces, you'll get the sound of that piece. We had a lot of fun animating all these as well. There's a couple of smaller ones. If you come to kind of the center of the sticks here, you can get the stick click. We also have some claps and some snaps. So, claps, snaps. The snaps are actually accidental. That was not intended. When we were recording this, Clara was basically indicating the velocity layers for me when I was editing by just holding her hand up and just snapping next to the shotgun mic. And I had so many of these that I thought, you know what? It might be fun to layer all these together a bunch and create these sort of like walls of snapping. There are less snaps in Cozy, and Concrete has even more of them. I very intentionally kind of loosely edited them. I didn't really bother trying to make them too perfect, in part because they were not intended to actually be in the instrument. So I kind of wanted to honestly make them about as spontaneous as they actually were. Though you will notice in some of these cases that sometimes there's a little bit of like a ringing out of a cymbal or a tom happening underneath them. They're very noisy, and if you're like really limiting this for any reason, you might notice that even more. So you can hear that going on underneath it. That's just kind of the nature of it. And then the clapping is we just layered us walking around the room clapping together. And we only have a couple layers for Cozy, and then on Concrete we have a lot more layers, and it's a bit louder and kind of more dispersed through the room. And if you come into Concrete, all of that is the same as well. I think the claps on concrete also sound really cool. Really aggressive and quite forward. Most of the stuff on concrete is a lot more aggressive and straightforward, honestly. If you listen to the two of these played against each other, you can really tell what a difference rooms alone make. And that's kind of part of the exercise of this kit, is the difference between the rooms and how you mic those rooms. So you really can get vastly different sounds out of the same kit with the same set of mics just by changing the environment you're in. Moving on now to the mixer page. With both of these, again, the mixer is all laid out the same, the only difference being that there is one extra channel on the very end here for concrete for the slate stereo pair for the rooms. This is one where you may also find that the font labels are a little bit easier for you. Maybe you'll find it a little bit easier to read each control with these. I'm going to have them on for the demonstration of the controls here in the concrete user interface, but off for Cozy. Now, with all of these, like on the front, if you control this anywhere, there will be a little text box that appears at the top of the channel to tell you the value of each of these. I tried doing them next to the control, but the way that Contact kind of pushes things, different like visual elements up and down, these are using labels. Labels usually appear under controls. So when I was trying to do it, they were just getting buried by the buttons and the other knobs, and you couldn't read them. So I moved them up to the top so they were actually usable. The mixer is more or less broken up into 5 sections. You have 4 effects, and then you have the kind of main standard pan, volume, mute, solo, etc. controls. There's a transient shaper at the top. There's a saturator underneath that, a standard 3-band equalizer underneath that, and a fairly standard straightforward compressor underneath that. It's laid out in a sort of traditional console style, so I wanted to make sure that I kind of more or less employed a similar mindset to that. I have some subtle striping in the background to differentiate the channels from each other. Each channel is 2 knobs wide, so they're also staggered the way they are on a lot of stuff like the SSLs typically. Each of these channels also has these power buttons, so you can turn them on and off. We're in the default setting, so the mixer is actually engaged, and some of these effects are on and off on the different channels. Another thing you can do here is that you can command-click on any control to reset it to its default value. So if you want to actually sit there and move things around and get things back to their kind of zeroed out state, for example, if you want to pan something back into the center, you can just command-click that control. Also, if we command-click on the volume here, you'll see that there's a little arrow through the heart. That is to indicate that you are at your 0 crossing, you're at your 0 dB point. So if you're just trying to drag these manually, that is the sort of indicator that you've hit your 0 dB as well. So going through the controls, they're all fairly straightforward. We have a transient shaper knob. Transient shaper is simple, the knob goes up, the transient gets a little bit pokier and sharper. The saturator, same thing, saturation knob goes up, saturation is introduced more into the signal. For the equalizer, on the left side we have a high pass and a low pass, as well as the Q, so the width of the bell for your center band. On the right side, we have the frequency and we have the volume. So once again, think of them staggered. Frequency, volume for your center, your Q for your center, and your high pass and your low pass. For the compressor, we have the threshold ratio and makeup on the right side, and the attack and release on the left side. Again, kind of pairing controls that make sense together. So attack release right here, come over here, you got your thresh, your ratio, your makeup. So yeah, so think about it as attack, ratio, makeup. You can also use the makeup as a part of the gain staging if you have the compressor in, and then you just shape the attack and release times here right next to those controls. And again, each of these parts can be brought in or out to taste. At the bottom here, we have your kind of standard mixer fare. You have your pan knob at the top. You have your volume here. You have a mute control. You can tell that the mute is on if the guy's little face is kind of X'd out. So if I'm playing around, I can take the snare top and bottom out. The snare is very, very present in the room, so let's just take the rooms away. Now you're really only hearing it kind of in the overheads. And now I'm playing it and you can't hear it at all because it's just been removed entirely. And the same thing, of course, we have Cool S for the solo. So there's the binaural mic for Concrete, quite distant. Underneath that, we have the phase inversion, so if you have anything that you want to flip the phase on, you can see one of these channels actually is flipped because I found it sounded a little better here on the Kick 2. You can also see that we have different color tape to indicate the different groups of channels, and everything is labeled accordingly. Kick 1, 2, 3, we have the snares, we have the toms, snare top, bottom, overheads, we have overhead mono, which is a shotgun, the overhead stereo. We have a room mid, room side, room binaural, and on Concrete only, the room slate. And then we also have the channel output assignments. This is really useful if you want to really get the full effect of this kit. I definitely recommend multi-output. I have a patch coming up later that shows both of these multi-output and how you can kind of play with that. I also have a video on how to multi-output a drum kit. It's very useful and massively increases the power of the kit to be used in your own mixes, especially again because we made these to sound and feel like a raw, natural kit. And being able to mix them like a traditional kit in a set of multi-tracks is completely available to you, and you can really mess these up or really tighten them up, depending on if you want something completely ridiculous or something very grounded and very honest feeling. Moving on again to the Bleed tab, this is one of the more fun and unique parts of this kit. The Bleed allows you to really dig into it. We're not the first people to introduce like a bleed control into a kit, or just the idea of bleed in a kit, but up until actually just a few days ago, as far as I've seen, we were the first, or at least one of the first, to introduce the control of the bleed to this level of detail. So again, we have the bleed control, which is available on all pages up at the top right. And if we go in, we're gonna switch over to Cozy here. You can hear it's very intimate, it's very straightforward. And then if we add the bleed in, so let's play this sort of MIDI that I have here. You can hear a little bit more of that sort of bloom come in when I introduce the bleed with the little estrogen button here. But you can also control how much of everything bleeds in, and that's kind of the fun of this section and layout specifically. So this is laid out as a sort of grid, as a sort of matrix. The idea basically being that the row is the mic, and then the columns are the pieces of the kit and how much of them you want bleeding into those mics. Now, if you look at them, you'll see we don't have the overheads or the rooms. Overheads and rooms are supposed to hear everything, so it doesn't really make sense to take the bleed in and out of overheads and rooms. Those are just going to be left natural. But for all of these individual kit pieces, all these shell mics, and if we had like a hi-hat mic, for example, we would have done it with that too, then you can sit here and you can basically say, I like the sound of the snare, but I think that maybe there's a little bit too much of the snare here in the kick mic. So I can come here and I can just turn down the snare in the kicks, and there's just a little bit less of it. Likewise, if I think that the kick drum is annoying in the snare, I can turn the kick drum down or take it out entirely from the snare mics. So you can get really granular with this. And that's kind of what we wanted. We wanted something that you could really mess with. You can turn it up too, by the way. You can really mess things up. It'll sound pretty ugly if you do, but if you really wanted to bring the kick drum into the snare mic too much, then you could definitely just push it there. And, you know, now they've just got that little bit of extra, and the same thing, and just push the kick drum into your snare mics. And now it's really sort of ringy and weird, and you can really break this. Again, we wanted something that could be kind of a sonic playground, something that was raw, but something that you could really push and break and make even uglier if you really wanted to. It's punk rock, you know? There's no kind of rule in punk rock about making everything beautiful and smooth and clean. So if you want this kit to be less smooth or less clean than it typically is, then you have that. And one thing, of course, that is cool about this is that getting that natural kit sound, it makes a huge difference to actually have all the kit pieces bleeding into each other. That's one of the big differences that you'll hear between a live kit and a sampled kit. But being able to turn down the parts that do kinda suck in the other mics also really makes a difference, because sometimes the bleed introduces a lot of kind of ugliness into it. So the control here really allows you to decide just how much you want to push the line between a tighter, traditional sampled kit where there's no bleed of anything into anything else, or a really aggressive, raw, natural kit where there's way too much bleed of everything into everything else. You can make this as raw or as tight as you want, and this section, I think, is one of the things that really helps this kit come to life. The final control page we have here, or pages because there are two, is the key assignments. So this is your articulation set. It is set up so that you have the shells and the additional stuff on the first page, and then all the symbols on the second page. And again, you will notice that there's some stuff crossed out, and I've opened 2 different versions of each kit to show you how that stuff works and why it's crossed out. But we'll start by just introducing the basics of the assignments. So again, the first thing about this is, one thing we've done to break this is that you can actually assign multiple articulations to one key. And we even have a couple presets where you do that, where you put the 2 floor toms on one key and the 2 rack toms, and so you just have 2 toms and they're just really huge and obnoxious. The reason we did that again is we wanted something you could kind of break. But I also want to give you a warning that as of the current version of this, which we will likely update, there is no indication as to whether or not something else is on the same key as another piece of the kit. So you do want to be careful with that, and you want to kind of listen for it, or just kind of double check all of your values and make sure nothing's crossing over if you don't want anything to cross over. The assignments are quite straightforward. You have this value edit box that allows you to just bring your assignment up and down. So if I just click that, my kick now is on my B0, and I can put that up. Now it's on my C1. You also have this sort of MIDI control button. If you press this, you are now telling it to assign this articulation to whatever key you press next. If you're playing on an E kit, then you can tap whatever part of the E kit you want to assign this to. So if our mapping doesn't work for you, and it probably won't because mapping is really inconsistent, if you want to assign your kick to your kick pad, you just press this, and then you press whatever your pad is, you play it, it'll tell it that that's the input it should be looking for. And once again, it's on 0. And again, I can put multiple things on here, so if I take the snare rim shot, my E1 currently, I can put that on B0, and now I got the kick and the snare playing on the same piece. So assign those back to their defaults. But you can do this with any piece of the kit. And one of the other things is that when we recorded all these articulations, Clara really wanted to have a little bit of control over everything. She never really liked the sound of flams as they're programmed, so we played flams for the snares and the toms as a separate articulation. So we play one of the toms here. You got that kind of flamming going on. Got the same thing again with the snare drum. We got some rim shots. We got some sticks. We got the cross stick, which gives you a little bit more of that kind of clunky body to it. We don't have cross sticks on the toms, so we did consider it. So toms are a lot more straightforward. We just have our hit, little click, and then the flams. And again, you can look at all of these and kind of play with them, and you can layer them or do whatever you want with them. On the cymbals, we also did multiple articulation points. We did the bell of the cymbal, the center of the cymbal, and the edge of the cymbal. You can tell here that there's also an X. The X is a mute for the cymbal. And so I can take any one of these, and based on what the mute is for that cymbal, so let's say We'll play the Crash 16 here. The mute is going to be D sharp 0, and C4 is going to be our edge. So I play the edge here, and I can use that manual mute to just choke out the cymbal. So you also have the ability to just kind of get a little bit more creative with your playing. Getting to the stuff that is crossed out. We have two versions of this kit. Clara usually likes to kind of program the parts when she's writing with sample drums, and so she wanted to have it laid out so that each level of the hi-hat here, and you'll see that we have 5 levels. We have the standard hat, just hat 1, which on this kit is the closed hat, and then it becomes more open as you get through 2, 3, 4, and 5. So we have 5 levels of openness on the hat. Clara wanted each of those to be their own keys that she could just put together and program in with the MIDI and not have to worry about. But we also have the Performer kit, which is what you see down here. Both Cozy and Concrete come with a Performer and a Programmer version of the kit, so you can program the MIDI individually or play it and perform it on an E-kit. So what we do with the Performer version is that we just have these 3 hits for the bell, the center, and the edge of the hi-hat. And then down here, what is crossed out up there is a control that controls how much the hat is open. So if I switch over here, we're going to unmute Cozy and we're going to mute Concrete. And we're just going to kind of demonstrate this. The assignment here, by the way, is set to the mod wheel. Depending on what your DAW settings are. I make that point because it actually doesn't work in Logic for me right now. You can also right-click and tell it to learn a CC automation, so you can put in a control from your keyboard or your E-kit, for example, your pedal, and it will learn to perform on that sort of CC value. But there is also just this little slider that controls the openness and closeness of the hat. So, it's pretty tight right now. We're just kind of playing here on the edge. And you can get it to open and close. So you can kind of get that hat pedal. You can program it to sort of do like a... And you can kind of open and close it. And if you're performing on an E-kit, you can use that to give yourself a little bit more of a dynamic sort of hat and a little bit more control over the sound of the hat. We also have this control here, which inverts the openness and closeness of the hi-hat. So if you have a pedal and pressing down on the pedal is increasing the CC value, which means that it's opening the hat, and you don't want that and you want it to feel natural, like playing a real kit where you press the pedal in and it closes the hat, you'll invert that. It inverts the CC value that's being fed into that control, and pressing down on your pedal will then mean that you are closing the hat instead of opening it. So we wanted to make sure that the control made sense there. It's not really too different other than that. It's basically just the difference between the version of the kit that's meant to be played on an E-kit, or that you want to change and program with automation as a lane in your DAW, versus trying to actually program every single thing individually. It's up to your workflow and up to your preference, and we wanted, of course, because this is Clara's kit, to give her preference for how to play this. If you're looking at the NKI instruments in your folder and you're asking yourself, why is one called Player? That's why. Now that we've looked at the UI, let's talk about some of the presets and the multi-output function of Cozy and Concrete. Our mindset of using the kit in ways that are pushing its limits or broken or unusual sounding carried on in our presets just as much as it did in our design and our programming of the kits. Some of the presets are more functional or just more natural sounding. Some of them are a bit ridiculous and over the top. Some points we were just kind of playing with it until we had something that we thought just sounded cool or sounded really dumb and made us laugh. Whatever it was. For both Cozy and Concrete, the first one you're going to see is a preset called 00 Init. This is a full zeroed out version of the kit. This is everything set to its default level. Every volume is set to 0 dB, the pans are in the center, Everything is set to a default setting. The main idea of this particular setting is that this is how you can output it for multi-output use. The idea being that the init is essentially everything is exactly as it is from a recording of the kit, raw, as if you had just got the multi-tracks from the session, and nothing at all has been balanced or mixed or prepared in any way whatsoever. If you listen to the init preset, you'll hear that it's kind of rough and kind of unbalanced, and in Concrete you'll see that it's also very roomy. In Cozy here you can tell the snare drum is a bit louder, the cymbals are pretty soft, the kick is pretty subtle. In Concrete, you can tell in the init preset the cymbals are not quite even, the snare drum again is very loud, and there's a lot of the rooms. The rooms really overpower Concrete if you don't dial them back or kind of bring them in line. Going back here to Cozy, I don't remember what the exact idea was in the naming of this particular preset. It was some dumb joke I think that we made between ourselves when we were listening to it. But this is an example of a little bit more kind of natural sounding live drum kit preset that we have. Whereas we have really ridiculous extreme examples like Just Too Much, which, as the name implies, is just too much. When we created this one, we were just kind of playing around with the extent of what you could do with any of these controls individually. What is essentially just the kit pushed to the most absurd limits possible. And what you get out of that is an almost kind of unnatural, processed, electric sounding kit. The toms are where that really stands out to me the most. You can hear that the noise floor is so high that the tail of that even ends up having a little bit of the shuffling in the background. This is something where you'd almost want to use it in a sound design sense and kind of really play with it a bit, and probably want to gate it and put in some automation, or even just resample it and use it as something else. But this is an example of how you can kind of process the kit to the point where it becomes something entirely different from what it's supposed to be. Almost as a sort of like sound design engine machine type of thing, just as much as a natural feeling and sounding kit. And again, this is the kind of thing we were going for with that line between being a very real natural kit and being something that's very sampled and very processed. Here in Concrete, we have this preset, Sabatoms. In this one, we layered the toms together so that we have both of the floor toms on one key and both of the rack toms on one key. We also put the two keys together next to each other so that they'd be a little easier to play and program. The idea being to take the toms and make them just a bit bigger and a bit more bombastic and obnoxious than they were individually. And with presets like Water Tower, we ended up creating this sort of oddly filtered, lo-fi, spacey kind of sound that kind of felt like the drums are being played underwater or recorded from inside a barrel of water. So just another example of something you can do with a kit that's very unusual and sort of out of the standard wheelhouse that it would typically fit in as a natural raw sounding kit. Both kits also have a default preset, which is the preset that is loaded when you actually load the kit into Kontakt. You'll have heard that earlier when I've been playing examples while walking through the user interface. And that one's basically a more or less balanced, mix ready, but still more raw sound for the kit. Now I have an example of Concrete set up as a multi-output instrument. This leans a little more into the natural raw use case of the kit. However, this can be good if you want to really mess things up as well on an individual or mic basis. This can be really good for sound design, but the idea here is to work the way that I personally like to work with sample drums, which is to break them out into a multi-channel setup and actually mix them as if this was a set of raw recordings that I'd actually gotten for a session or from a session. I like to be able to process them with my own plugins, with my own settings, with my own ear, and I know a lot of people usually will not use or heavily use the built-in features in, say, the mixers or the master bus or anything like that. And for the people who don't want to use that stuff or don't want to be simply limited to what is available within Kontakt itself, the option here to multi-out is very powerful. I have another video on actually making a multi-output instrument using a different drum library. Different DAWs are going to treat it a little bit differently, but the part in Kontakt itself should remain the same. Here I have it broken out for a patch I have in Logic, which I've actually saved. This includes processing on all the pieces of the kit. So this is a kind of more real and natural sounding set of samples, as again, though I had received them as multi-tracks for a session. And you can hear here that I've kept some of the bleed in the different kit pieces. You can turn it up or down as ever. You'll see, for example, here I have just a little bit of the kick in the snare top and bottom mics, and the snare I've just removed entirely from the kick. But if I push that up a little bit, in this case, I want to kind of keep a little bit more of a sampled feel, but not completely. I still want to have that natural vibe, but I want to focus a little bit more on the close mics and have only just enough bleed, at least in the kick and snare, to give it that kind of natural, fuller sound. The other thing, of course, that's great, again, using your own plugins, you can really shape and contour with a lot of different things. One good example here, if I pull up Drumforge's DS Smack, this is a really aggressive and sort of in-your-face plugin. So this is something you can put on your shells. And if we listen to the kick here, you can hear now that it's a lot more sort of pokey and aggressive. If I turn it off, it's a little bit rounder. But if I wanted to get that slightly more metal sound out of it, I can bring this into it, and I can use it for a metal track. Let's engage it here on the snare as well. You can hear that the snare without it is a little bit darker, bringing it back in as we had when we first started playing it. A lot brighter, a lot more forward, and again, good for a little bit of that kind of metal sound. The other thing that's great here is that even though you have that really big, overwhelming kind of room in concrete already, and you can see here on concrete that I have the rooms really low, I can put the snare and the toms into this other reverb, and I can use this as a sort of controllable room that's a little bit more, maybe unnatural, but might still smooth out the sound in a bigger, thicker mix. Again, thinking metal, it's not unusual to have big rooms in a metal mix and still have these huge compressed reverb buses as well. And you can kind of interchange which one is dominating the room space of the drum kit, but also you can get that bigger kick and snare without having as much of the cymbals in there. This again is another place where maybe you'd want to dial the bleed back a little bit so that you don't have cymbals bleeding in to these kind of fake room reverbs. I still have the bleed in, but if you didn't like the sound of that, you could take that out. And so you got a bigger, punchier, meaner sounding kit out of your own plugins with the multi-output. Pulling up Cozy now, we have a similar setup, a little bit different processing for the different sound of the kit itself. Not as different on the close-up mics, but a little different on the overheads in the rooms. This can demonstrate a little bit of the power of Cozy specifically, in that as a very intimate, small kit with 3 different room mics You can also get really creative with the room sound in this. This is one where you can take the reverb that I have out here and just have the natural sound of the kit. And you have more or less a very upfront, very kind of close and cuddly kind of kit. Something, again, very cozy. But the great thing about something like this is it gives you the power to shape your own rooms how you want. So you can do the kick and the snare into its own bus, like I did on Concrete. However, you'll hear when I bring the bus in here that the reverb I have on this is a little bit more kind of slapbacky and a little bit of kind of borderline delayed, even more than a reverb. So you can get a little bit of that kind of back and forth with it, and you can almost use it as a sort of timed effect. So if you want to shape the reverb in a way that kind of changes the vibe or feel of the kit, Cozy is really good for that. You can do the same with Concrete, but you'd have to kind of take the rooms out or be okay with it being layered into the rooms. If you come down here, you'll see that I have the 3 room mics from Cozy all split out on their own. And I have put a Space Designer, an IR reverb, onto one of these 3 buses. And it's pretty big. If you listen to it without the reverb, it's very intimate, very straightforward. But what's great about this is you can put your own sort of IRs, your own kind of flavor of reverb onto these essentially more or less flat, blank room mics that you have in Cozy, and you can create a little bit more of a natural sound, but you can kind of choose what type of room you actually want this kit to have, and even choose different types of rooms for the different room mics on the kit. So if you want something that's a little smoother, a little more under control, Cozy also gives you the power to do that quite uniquely. And that's one of the things I actually really like personally about working with these kind of super dead, super intimate drums, is they give you a little bit more of that creative kind of workflow that you can mess with. Another advantage, of course, of breaking these out is that you can automate something like the reverb. If you want to basically put an effect on the snare, if you want the snare to be really huge in one spot, you can throw the reverb onto the snare bus or onto the rooms or somewhere else that you want that to kind of come through and automate in and out the intensity of that reverb. You can do this in Contact as well. There's no reverb on Cozy or Concrete in the user interface that's actually built in, other than the rooms themselves, though you could automate the rooms on Concrete if you wanted to as well. But even if I had included that on this instrument, you would be going through pages and pages of controls to find the reverb to automate, whereas this gives you a little bit faster workflow to just simply go into the plugin and grab the control, usually pretty close to the top of the menu, and you're pretty much set to go. So this gives you a little bit of ability to automate stuff, even if it is in the instrument, in a plugin or somewhere else where it's just a little easier to get through than going through the 500 or so controls that we actually have in the Contact user interface that are going to appear in your macros. At the end of the day, opening up the doors to possibilities beyond simply throwing some MIDI in and letting some drums play along to it. I hope you found this walkthrough helpful. If you want to buy Cozy or Concrete, they're sold together as one package on our website. They're usually going for about $90. It is an even revenue split between us as well as Vasily and Clara of Peak Divide, so you can support them directly by purchasing these drums. In addition, be sure to go check out their stuff individually and support them directly. Support their games, support their projects. There's also free versions if you can't afford the full version right now, or you're just not sure about it yet. The free versions are available on Contact and Decent Sampler, also through our site. If you have any questions, feel free to ask down below or reach out to us. We are happy to help you out with anything that you're uncertain about or just want further clarification on. And if you have anything that you've created with Cozy or Concrete, please share it around. We'd love to see what weird, unusual, or even just really awesome, really straightforward, raw stuff you're making with these. And thank you for watching, and happy creating.